The last version of this line of argument against utilitarianism is a little less dramatic, a little more nuanced than these egregious, unjust acts and these egregious violations of the rights of individuals. In cases that Rachel considers in this last grouping, what we have are commitments, obligations that are created by past actions that seem to have a bearing on the ethical status of some current action, and yet get ignored in the evaluation of that action's ethical status on utilitarian lines. And that is, the net happiness produced in the moment is all that matters in the determination of the ethical standing of these actions. And yet, from an intuitive or commonsensical perspective, these things that happened in the past, these decisions that people make, commitments, obligations, duties that result from those past actions seem relevant to determining the ethical status of the current case. And so Rachel's imagines a relatively mundane case where you promise to meet your friend. And in doing so, from an intuitive or common sense perspective, you seem to make a decision that results in you having an obligation to your friend. However, that's in the past. In the moment, you have to decide whether or not you're actually going to bother to meet them or stand them up. And because you've got a big project due at work that's very important, it'll have a big impact on your and other people's happiness, and you can't get a hold of your friend to cancel, you decide the greatest good would result from your standing your friend up. And in fact, that's the outcome that produces the greatest net happiness. And that's from the utilitarian perspective, that's the action that is the most ethically praiseworthy. And yet, from our intuitive or commonsensical perspective, this seems somewhat unethical or ethically dubious. It seems relevant that we made this commitment, that we acted in the past in a way that obliged us in the present, and yet utilitarianism ignores all of those sorts of features that seem ethically relevant to determining the status of the action. And of course, we can see how this would play out on a larger scale if, in fact, the actions that people take in the past have no bearing on the ethical status of their actions in the present. Then there is no net ethical negative in cases where people make decisions or commitments that obligate them or create a duty on their part to perform some action in the future, where if in the future that action really won't create the greatest good for the greatest number. So, for example, you can imagine, right, someone decides to have a child, and then after they have the child, they realize, you know what, this is definitely not making me happy. I could probably figure it all out, and certainly I made this huge commitment in having a child. But I just leave it on the doorstep of the firehouse and the child gets adopted. The family that adopts the child, maybe they'll be made much happier by my actions. And I'll certainly be a lot happier. And so the greatest happiness is produced by my abandoning my child. And so I don't really need to consider whether or not I have a duty and an obligation to raise my own child if I can dump my child off somewhere and have it result in a greater net happiness. So that's how all of these objections go. They try to break that connection, that exclusive and exhaustive determination of an action's ethical status by looking at exclusively and exhaustively the net production of happiness that results directly from that action. Now, the final class of objections that Rachel looks at are objections that question whether or not the mechanism for impartiality that's built into utilitarianism, that mechanism that's supposed to guarantee the equal consideration of the interests of all people affected, in fact, really does meet that standard of equal consideration that seems to be built into that minimum conception of morality that he talked about in those first readings. So Rachel's wants to challenge in this last set of objections the idea that treating everyone's happiness as equally valuable in all circumstances is in fact a ethically sound way to achieve equal consideration of interests, or whether or not it looks like it's an ineffectual way of achieving that impartiality that he suggests is part of the minimum conception of morality. So in the next segment, we'll look at those objections.